right, we're going to touch a little bit on food webs in lake systems, just so you're familiar with the words that might come up later that we might use. Of course, at the base of any lake food web is the essential nutrients that all organisms like and use, and those are nitrogen and phosphorus. We talked about those a lot when we were talking about testing the water quality earlier in the year. The nitrogen and phosphorus, as you know, are really important for the phytoplankton. Okay? Phytoplankton are any organisms that need sunlight and carbon dioxide to go through photosynthesis. And these are all going to be microscopic. So they could be algae. They could also be protists. Protists, remember, are little one-celled critters like an amoeba or a euglena that have some characteristics of plants, so they can go through photosynthesis, but also some characteristics of animal cells in that sometimes they can move around. This also includes a group of organisms called the diatoms. Diatoms are a type of algae, but instead of having cell walls like typical algae do, their cell walls are made out of something called silicon. So all of these phytoplankton rely on nitrogen and phosphorus, as well as sunlight and carbon dioxide, to go through photosynthesis and be the producers of our food chain. Now, the organisms that eat those come in two types in general. We have the zooplankton. Looks like it's spelled zooplankton, but it's pronounced zooplankton. And we have what are called shad. So let's talk about those separately first. The zooplankton. These again are microscopic for the most part. Okay. They are considered part of the animal kingdom. And of course they eat these phytoplankton. An example of a zooplankton would be something called a daphnia. That's these little critters right here. Or a rotifer. That's what these little guys are right here. The shad, on the other hand, are a type of fish related to herring. And they rely on algae and other phytoplankton for the majority of their diet. The reason they're important to the food chain is because they are the food for a lot of bigger game fish, like bass, for example. So that's why we put them right here in the food chain. All right, working our way up. The zooplankton are eaten by juvenile species of a lot of the fish that we catch in Minnesota lakes for sport fishing, like walleye and bass and northerns. And the shad, as I said earlier, are also eaten by these big game fish. So of course, as you know about food webs, removing or decreasing the numbers of any one of these individuals in the food chain is going to affect the others. And the lake's effect on the growth of these different organisms is pretty dramatic as well. Some lakes have a lot of phytoplankton, some do not, and that's going to affect the types of other organisms, and at the very top, the game fish that are growing in that lake. So the plants, the producers in the food web, are obviously the most important for setting the basis for what that lake is going to be like, what kinds of fish and other organisms are going to be supported in that lake. So we're going to quickly go over the types of aquatic plants a little bit more closely so you can see what these producers look like. First of all, we've got the plankton algae, which I touched on a little bit. These are floating algae, so they'd float in that euphotic limnetic zone. They float in the open water. And when you see the lakes in Minnesota in August look like really green in color, it's usually due to these types of algae. They cause what's called that algal bloom. You get all sorts of algae all over the lake. The second type is something called a filamentous algae, and it will grow as long strands in a lake. Sometimes people call this pond scum. So if you kind of scoop your hand through the water and you get these like threads on your hand, that is this filamentous algae. So it's actually an algae, it's not a plant. An example of this is the microcystis, which actually can be a little bit dangerous if it gets in too high amounts in a lake. Third type is called Stonewort Algae, which is a type of branching algae. You can see in the picture there. It can get pretty big, 2 to 3 feet in height. It's found more in southeastern Minnesota, where they have more of a limestone-based soil because it likes a little bit more acidic environments. If you've ever heard of muskgrass algae, that's what this is. It's a stonewort. Okay, and the last thing I'm going to touch on, which I've already kind of alluded to, is that there are really important things for having algae in a lake, but then there are some kind of negative side effects too if those algae take over. So the positives, of course, are that they are the producers in a food web. And so, as we saw earlier, they are the basis of a lot of different organisms' diet. Also, they produce oxygen for those organisms living in the lake. So anything that needs to use oxygen, whether it's those zooplankton or different species of fish, they are relying on the oxygen that's produced by the algae and other plants in the water to actually survive. The negatives, however, are quite a few if these algae get out of control. First of all, when these algae decompose and die, they use up oxygen. So if there's a lot of algae that have died over the winter, or died in the fall and then overwinter in the bottom of the lake, they're going to be using oxygen in that lake as they decompose. So they can decrease oxygen levels that way. Also, some algae produce toxic chemicals. The microcystis that I showed you earlier with the filamentous algae, they actually do produce a toxic chemical to prevent things from eating them, which is not only bad for the food web, but also for the water quality. Some types of algae can damage fish gills just because they either release those toxic chemicals or they clog the fish gills. And some algae cause human sickness. You know, occasionally in the summer you'll see the DNR has put out warnings on different lakes that you shouldn't swim in those lakes because there's an algae bloom that could make you sick. Anabena, which is what this picture is one of those algae. And then finally, as you well know, in the late summer, in a lake that has a lot of algae growing in it, can give off a pretty bad odor, which takes away some of the desire to actually use that lake, whether it be for fishing or swimming or any other type of recreation. That's the end of this vodcast on lake or lentic ecology.